Rain fell in soft sheets over the city, turning sidewalks into mirrors and streetlights into hazy halos. On the steps of a shuttered bookstore, a girl sat cross-legged, her back straight against the cold brick wall, fingers resting lightly on the keys of a second-hand keyboard balanced on a milk crate. The cord snaked across the wet pavement to a nearby cafe outlet, its plug wrapped in electrical tape that had seen better days. Her coat was too thin for the weather, her shoes scuffed at the toes, but her posture was calm, like someone used to waiting. She wasn't begging. She was playing softly at first, just a few notes of Clair de Lune, the kind of melody people recognized even if they didn't know its name. Tourists hurried past with umbrellas, dropping the occasional coin into the open guitar case beside her. Office workers on lunch break barely glanced her way, but she didn't mind. She played for the same reason she'd played every day since her grandmother passed, because it kept her close. Her grandmother used to hum Debussy while folding laundry, saying, "Music is the quiet voice that stays with you when everyone else leaves." Now, with no one left to talk to, the girl let her fingers speak for her. The afternoon wore on. Rain soaked the edges of her sleeves, but she didn't pack up. Rain meant fewer people, but also fewer distractions. Sometimes, in the quiet, she dared to play harder pieces, the ones she'd learned by watching blurry videos on the library's old computer, pausing and rewinding until her fingers ached. She'd never had a real teacher, just memory, patience, and a stubborn kind of hope. Then a sleek black SUV rolled to a stop at the curb. The window slid down. Out stepped a man in a charcoal overcoat, polished shoes clicking against the wet pavement. He carried himself like someone used to being watched, chin high, shoulders back, eyes scanning the street like he owned it. His name was known in boardrooms and business magazines, but here on this ordinary sidewalk, he looked out of place like a painting hung in the wrong room. He spotted the girl. "Seriously?" he said, turning to the man beside him. "That's what passes for talent these days? A kid banging on a toy with a power cord?" His voice wasn't quiet. People nearby turned. The girl kept her eyes on the keys, but her fingers stilled. The man in the coat stepped closer, arms crossed. "You think that's music?" "That's background noise," he smirked. "Tell you what, play something that doesn't sound like a broken music box and I'll adopt you right here. Give you a real home, real lessons, the whole fairy tale." A few people laughed nervously. One woman looked away, uncomfortable. The man's tone wasn't kind. It was a joke, a performance for his entourage. He didn't mean it. He just liked being the loudest voice in the room. The girl didn't cry. She didn't snap back. She just sat there, small and still, the rain misting around her. For a long moment she stared at her hands, small, calloused from carrying groceries and scrubbing floors, but steady. Then, without looking up, she placed her fingers back on the keys. She didn't play. Clair de Lune again. She took a breath and began. Debussy's Arabesque No. 1. The first notes shimmered like sunlight through rain. Light, fluid, full of grace. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. A delivery cyclist braked mid-ride. The man in the coat froze, his smirk dissolving into confusion, then disbelief. This wasn't a child's clumsy attempt. This was art. Her hands moved with a certainty that defied her age. Rippling arpeggios, delicate trills, phrases that danced like leaves on water. She played not for applause, not for the promise of adoption, but because this piece had lived inside her since the night her grandmother took her last breath. She'd found it by accident on an old cassette tape in a shoebox, and it had become her lullaby, her prayer, her way of saying, "I miss you." Rain fell harder now, soaking her hair, dripping off the edge of the keyboard, but she didn't flinch. The music swelled, playful, then tender, then soaring. People gathered without realizing they were doing it. A street vendor turned off his radio. A mother pulled her stroller to a stop. Even the cafe staff came to the door, wiping their hands on aprons, eyes wide. The man in the coat stood completely still. His arms dropped to his sides. His face, once full of arrogance, now held something unfamiliar. Awe. He'd heard this piece performed in concert halls by world-famous pianists. But never like this. Never with this kind of raw, unguarded heart. When the final notes faded, light as a sigh, the entire block fell into a silence so deep you could hear the rain hitting the pavement. Then, from the back, someone clapped one pair of hands, then two, then 10. Soon the street erupted in applause, not politely, but with real feeling, like they'd just witnessed something sacred. The girl unplugged her keyboard slowly, carefully coiled the cord and placed it in her worn backpack. She picked up the guitar case, gave a small nod, not to the crowd, not to the man in the coat, just to the ground, and walked away, disappearing into the gray afternoon. The man stood there, soaked and speechless as the crowd slowly dispersed. His assistant approached. "Sir, the meeting—" He didn't answer right away. He just stared at the empty milk crate where the girl had sat, as if trying to understand how someone so small could carry so much music inside. And for the first time in years, he felt small himself. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But he knew one thing. He had to find her. Not to adopt her, but to listen. The rain kept falling long after the crowd had gone, washing the city clean but leaving one man standing on a wet sidewalk, soaked to the bone and utterly still. He hadn't moved since the girl disappeared around the corner. His expensive coat clung to his shoulders, his shoes ruined by puddles, but he didn't care. All he could hear was the echo of those notes, light, fluid, impossible, ringing in his chest like a bell that wouldn't stop. He wasn't used to feeling unsettled. His life ran on control, schedules, data, outcomes he could predict and command. He built empires by knowing what came next. But this made no sense. A child alone on a bookstore step playing Debussy like it was second nature. It felt like a dream. And yet the dampness of his clothes, the ache in his throat, the stunned faces of strangers, all of it was real. So the next morning, before the city fully woke, he returned to the same corner. The milk crate was gone. No keyboard. No guitar case. Just wet pavement and the smell of wet brick. He stood there, hands in his pockets, wondering if he'd imagined it all. Maybe the stress of back-to-back mergers had finally caught up with him. Maybe he'd heard what he wanted to hear. A story, a moment of magic in a world that felt increasingly hollow. Then he noticed the cafe, the one with the outlet she'd used. He walked in, ordered black coffee he didn't really want, and asked the barista if she knew anything about the girl with the keyboard. "Oh, her?" the woman said, wiping the counter. "Yeah, she's been coming here for months. Always polite, never asks for anything. Just plugs in, plays for an hour or two, then leaves. Says her grandma taught her to love music." She paused, her voice softening. "She passed last winter. The girl's been on her own since." "On her own?" he asked, voice quieter than he intended. "Yeah. Stays at the Maplewood Youth Shelter. Social services tried to place her, but she refused. Said she didn't want to be a burden." She shrugged. "Kid's got more quiet strength than most adults I know." Maplewood. He'd never heard of it. But by noon, he was standing outside a modest brick building on the edge of the neighborhood, far from the glass towers he called home. It wasn't fancy, just a clean, quiet place with a small garden and a sign that read, "A safe place to rest, learn, and grow." He didn't go in right away. He watched from across the street. And then, just before 3, he saw her. The girl walking up the path with her backpack, head down, shoulders slightly hunched against the world. She looked even smaller in daylight. He took a breath and crossed the street. Inside, the shelter was warm, smelling of soup and old books. A woman at the front desk looked up as he entered. She had kind eyes and silver streaks in her hair. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for the girl who plays piano," he said. "The one from the corner near the bookstore." She studied him for a moment, not with suspicion but with quiet assessment. "Why?" he hesitated. He could say he wanted to help. He could offer money. But something told him that wouldn't be enough. "I heard her play," he said finally. "And I need to understand how." She nodded slowly as if that answer meant more than any donation. "Her name is Lila. She's in the back room doing homework. But then she's been through a lot. Be gentle." She led him down a hallway lined with children's drawings and photos of field trips. At the end, in a small room with a window and a desk, sat the girl, bent over a math worksheet, pencil moving slowly. She looked up when they entered, and her eyes widened slightly when she saw who it was. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the man said, "I'm sorry." Lila blinked. "For what?" "For laughing. For making a joke out of something that clearly means everything to you." She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. "It's okay," she said softly. "Most people don't get it." "I didn't," he admitted. "But I want to." He didn't sit. He didn't try to impress. He just stood there, hands at his sides, like a student before a teacher. And then he asked the only question that mattered. How did you learn to play like that? Lila looked down at her hands. My grandma. She used to play at church. When I was little, I'd sit under the piano and listen. After my parents died, she said music would keep their voices alive. She paused. When she got sick, I'd play for her. She couldn't talk much at the end, but she'd squeeze my hand when I got a part right. The man felt something tighten in his throat. He thought of his own childhood, growing up in a cramped apartment, working odd jobs, vowing never to be poor again. He'd built a fortress of success to keep that past buried, but this girl hadn't run from her pain. She'd turned it into something beautiful. Do you have a piano here? He asked. No, Lila said. Just the keyboard. And the library lets me practice on there sometimes if no one's booked it. He nodded. Then, without fanfare, he pulled out his phone and made a call. Get me the best upright piano you can find, well-tuned, good action. Deliver it here by tomorrow. And find a music teacher, someone kind, patient. Not a show-off, just someone who loves the craft. Lila stared at him. Why? Because talent like yours shouldn't depend on a frayed power cord and spare change, he said. And because I was wrong. He didn't offer to adopt her. Didn't promise a mansion or fame. He just said, let me help you keep playing. Lila was quiet for a long time. Then she asked, will you come hear me play it when it arrives? Yes, he said. Every time you want me to. As he walked out of the shelter, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, glinting off wet leaves. He didn't feel like a billionaire. He didn't feel powerful. He just felt human again, and for the first time in years that was enough. But he didn't stop there. That evening, he called the shelter's director and quietly funded a dedicated music room. Soundproofed walls, proper lighting, shelves for sheet music. Not as a grand gesture, but as a simple act of respect. She deserves a real space, he told the director. Not just a corner. The next day, the piano arrived. Lila didn't run to it. She walked slowly, as if approaching something sacred. She ran her fingers over the wood, then pressed a single key. The note rang out clear and full, and she closed her eyes like she was tasting it. He stood in the doorway, watching. He didn't speak. He just listened. And in that quiet moment, something shifted, not just for her, but for him. He hadn't come to save her. She'd already saved herself. He was just finally learning how to listen. The piano sat in the newly built music room like a promise kept. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching dust motes that danced above the polished wood. Lila didn't rush to play it right away. She spent the first day just sitting beside it, running her fingers along the edge, listening to the quiet hum of the room. It felt too good to be true. A real piano in a real space just for her. After years of practicing on library keyboards with sticky keys or the old upright at the community center that was always out of tune, this felt like coming home. The man came the next day, not with fanfare, but with a paper bag of sheet music and 2 mugs of hot chocolate from the cafe down the street. He didn't say much, just set the mugs on the windowsill and leaned against the doorframe, watching as she finally placed her hands on the keys. She played a simple scale first, C major, slow and even, testing the touch, the response. Then without warning, she began Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the same piece her grandmother used to play on Sunday evenings while rain tapped the roof. He didn't move. Didn't breathe too loudly. He just listened, and for the first time in his life, he understood what people meant when they said music could heal. It wasn't magic. It was truth. And this girl spoke it fluently. Her teacher arrived a week later, an older woman with silver hair pulled into a loose bun and hands that looked like they'd coaxed beauty from pianos for decades. She didn't carry a briefcase or a syllabus, just a worn leather satchel with sheet music and a thermos of tea. I'm Ms. Rivera, she said simply. I used to teach at the conservatory. Now I teach anyone who listens. Lila sat at the piano. Ms. Rivera didn't ask her to play a scale or read notes. She just said, show me what lives inside you. Lila played the Debussy again, the piece from the rainy sidewalk. But this time it was richer, more confident, as if the piano itself was giving her permission to breathe deeper. When she finished, Ms. Rivera didn't praise her. She asked, why that piece? Because it sounds like hope, Lila said quietly. Like even when it's raining, the sun is still there. Ms. Rivera smiled. Then you already know more than most professionals ever will. Lessons began twice a week. The man came to everyone, Not to watch like a judge, but to sit in the back on a folding chair, sipping coffee from a paper cup, listening. He never spoke unless spoken to. He didn't offer advice. He just showed up, and slowly something shifted between them. Not friendship, not yet, but trust. Lila stopped flinching when the door opened. She'd glance over, see him there, and give a small nod before returning to the keys. One afternoon, after a particularly tough session on hand independence, Lila sighed and slumped forward, forehead resting on the piano. "I'll never get it right," she muttered. Ms. Rivera patted her shoulder. "Music isn't about right, it's about truth. If it feels true, it is right." The man, still in the back, spoke for the first time that day. "You played truth that day on the street. That's why I couldn't walk away." Lila looked at him, surprised. "You remember that?" "I remember every note." Later, as he walked back to his car, Ms. Rivera caught up with him. "You're not just funding lessons," she said gently. "You're becoming part of her story." He stopped. "I don't know how to do that. I've spent my life building walls, not bridges." "Then start small," she said. "Ask her about her grandma. Not her playing. Her hearing." So the next time, instead of sitting in the back, he brought 2 chairs and sat beside the piano. During a break, he asked, what was her favorite piece? Lila's eyes lit up. She loved Schubert. Said his music sounded like walking through a forest at dawn. She paused. She used to say, "If you can make someone feel the sunrise in a minor key, you've done your job." He repeated that line later that night, alone in his quiet penthouse. He'd never thought of music that way, never thought of anything that way. His world was numbers, deals, outcomes. But this girl spoke of sunrises in minor keys, and somehow, it made more sense than any quarterly report. Weeks passed. Lila's playing grew stronger, more expressive. She started composing short pieces, little melodies named things like Rain on the Roof or Grandma's Soup. One afternoon, she played one for him without warning. It was simple, just a few repeating chords with a gentle melody on top, but it carried a warmth that made his chest ache. "What's it called?" he asked. "The Man Who Listened," Lila said quietly. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, throat tight, and said, "Thank you." News of her began to spread, not through press releases but through word of mouth. A librarian mentioned her to a local radio host. A shelter volunteer told a friend who worked at a music school. Soon a small recital was organized in the shelter's garden. A folding chair audience, string lights, and Lila at the piano under a canopy of trees. He sat in the front row. When she played her original piece again, a few people wiped their eyes. Afterward, an older woman approached him. "You're doing a good thing," she said. "I'm not doing anything," he replied. "She's the one playing." "But you're the one who stayed," she said. "That matters more than you think." That night, as he drove home, he realized something. He hadn't thought about work all day. Not once. His mind had been full of music, of a girl's quiet courage, of the way a single note could hold an entire lifetime of love and loss. He wasn't saving Lila. Lila was saving him. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man who owned everything. He felt like a man who finally had something real to give. But the real test came a month later, when a local arts council invited her to perform at a youth showcase in a real theater. She was nervous. "What if I mess up?" she asked him the night before. He didn't offer empty reassurance. He just said, "Then you'll play through it, like you always do." The night of the concert, the theater filled quickly, not with celebrities, but with neighbors, teachers, shelter volunteers, kids from her school. He sat in the third row, same as always. When Lila walked on stage in a simple white dress, she didn't look like a prodigy. She looked like a girl who'd been given a chance and took it with both hands. She played 3 pieces. A Chopin nocturne, a lively Scarlatti sonata, and then something new, her own composition. As the first notes rang out, gentle and searching, he leaned forward. He recognized the melody. It was the one she'd played that rainy afternoon, the one called The Man Who Listened. But now it was fuller, richer, woven with new harmonies, like a conversation that had grown over time. In the middle, a single high note shimmered like a tear held back. Then the music swelled, not with showmanship but with gratitude. When it ended, the audience rose as one. Not because it was perfect, there was a slight stumble in the left hand near the end, but because it was real. Because it carried a story only 2 people in that room fully understood. Afterward, backstage, Lila found him waiting. No words were needed. They just stood there for a moment, the noise of the crowd muffled behind the curtain. Then Lila said, "I wrote the last part for you." "I know," he replied, voice rough, "and I'll carry it with me always." Later that week, he made an announcement no one expected. He was launching a foundation, not named after himself, but after the shelter, the Maplewood Music Initiative. It would provide free instruments, lessons, and performance opportunities for kids in underserved communities. "Talent doesn't care about your address," he told a small group of donors. "It only cares if someone gives you a chance to be heard." When asked why he'd done it, he simply said, "Because one girl played a melody that reminded me what really matters. And though they never signed adoption papers, though they never called each other daughter or dad, they had built something deeper. A family made not by law but by choice, by showing up, by listening." In the quiet after the applause faded, that was enough, more than enough. 2 years had passed since that rainy afternoon on the bookstore steps, and though the city kept rushing forward, new buildings rising, traffic thickening, seasons turning like pages in a well-worn book, something quiet and steady had taken root at the Maplewood Youth Shelter. The music room, once just a dream sketched on a napkin, was now alive with sound every day, scales practiced with determination, melodies tried and retried, laughter between chords. And every Saturday morning, without fail, a man in a simple wool coat would walk through the front doors carrying 2 paper cups of hot chocolate and a folder of sheet music tucked under his arm. The girl was no longer the small figure hunched over a broken keyboard in the rain. She was 12 now, taller, her posture confident, her hands strong from hours of practice. Her eyes still held that quiet depth, but there was light in them too. Curiosity, joy, the kind of peace that comes when you know you belong somewhere. She still lived in the small apartment above the shelter, not because she lacked options, but because this place had held her when the world felt like it was crumbling. She'd been offered spots in prestigious music programs, even a full scholarship to a boarding school for the arts. But each time she asked the same question, "Can I come back on weekends?" Because for her, music wasn't a ticket out. It was a way to stay connected, to her grandmother's memory, to the people who'd seen her before she was someone, to the man who'd learned to listen. And he was still there. Not as a distant benefactor, not as a figure of authority, but as a constant. He never missed a lesson, never interrupted. He'd sit in the back on a folding chair, hands wrapped around his cup, eyes closed, just listening. Over time, he'd stopped checking his phone, stopped glancing at his watch. He'd learned that real presence wasn't about time given, it was about attention offered. One spring afternoon, cherry blossoms drifting past the window like pink snow, Lila paused mid-phrase. She'd been working on a new piece, something complex, emotional, and her fingers had stumbled for the 3rd time. She let out a frustrated sigh and rested her forehead on the piano lid. "Do you ever wonder what my parents would have thought of me now?" she asked, voice muffled. He set his cup down. The question hung in the air, soft but heavy. He'd heard her mention them before, in passing, in dreams, but never like this. Never with such raw longing. "I think they'd be proud," he said carefully. "Not because you play beautifully, though you do, but because you're kind. Because you keep going even when it's hard." She sat up slowly, eyes glistening. "Grandma said they loved music too. Dad played guitar on Sundays. Mom sang lullabies in Spanish, soft like a whisper." She looked at her hands. "I don't remember their voices. Just the feeling. I wish I could have heard them," he said. "Me too." A long pause. Then quietly, "Do you ever miss your family?" The question surprised him. He'd spent decades building a life on self-reliance, on the belief that success meant never needing anyone. But sitting here in this room filled with the scent of old paper and warm wood, with a girl who'd lost everything and still chose to create beauty, the armor felt unnecessary. "Yes," he admitted, "I do. I got so busy running from my past I forgot it held good things too." Lila looked at him then, not with pity, but with understanding. "Maybe you don't have to run anymore." That night, he went home to his quiet penthouse and opened a storage box he hadn't touched in over 20 years. Inside were photographs. His mother in a faded floral dress, his father holding a toolbox, both standing in front of a tiny house with peeling paint and a crooked porch. He'd buried these memories under layers of ambition, ashamed of where he came from. But now, for the first time, he didn't see poverty. He saw love. He saw hands that worked hard, voices that sang off-key, a home that was small but full. The next week, he brought one of the photos to Lila. "This is my dad," he said, handing it to her. He worked construction, came home every night with dirt under his nails and a song in his head. Used to whistle old folk tunes while fixing the porch. Lila studied the image, her fingers tracing the edge. He looks like he knew how to fix more than just wood. He smiled. Yeah, he did. Something shifted after that. Their bond wasn't just about music anymore. It was about shared stories, quiet healing, the unspoken understanding that family isn't always blood. It's who shows up when the world goes silent. Then came the invitation that would test everything. The city's historic Orpheum Theater was hosting a youth arts showcase, and they wanted Lila to perform a solo set, not as a charity case but as a featured artist. "Your playing speaks to people," the organizer told her. We'd be honored. She was nervous. What if I mess up in front of everyone? He didn't offer empty praise. He just said, "Then you'll play through it, like you always do." The night of the concert, the theater filled quickly, not with celebrities or critics, but with neighbors, teachers, shelter volunteers, kids from her school. He sat in the third row, same as always. When Lila walked on stage in a simple white dress, she didn't look like a prodigy. She looked like a girl who'd been given a chance and took it with both hands. She played 3 pieces. A Chopin nocturne full of longing, a lively Scarlatti sonata that made people smile, and then something new, her own composition. As the first notes rang out, gentle and searching, he leaned forward. He recognized the melody. It was the one she'd played that rainy afternoon, the one she'd later named The Man Who Listened. But now it was fuller, richer, woven with new harmonies like a conversation that had grown over time. In the middle, a single high note shimmered like a tear held back. Then the music swelled, not with showmanship, but with gratitude, with trust, with love. When it ended, the audience rose as one. Not because it was perfect. There was a slight stumble in the left hand near the end, but because it was real. Because it carried a story only 2 people in that room fully understood. Afterward, backstage, Lila found him waiting. No words were needed. They just stood there for a moment, the noise of the crowd muffled behind the curtain. Then she said, "I wrote the last part for you." "I know," he replied, voice rough. "And I'll carry it with me always." Later that week, he announced the expansion of the Maplewood Music Initiative into a citywide program, funding instruments, training teachers, turning unused community rooms into music spaces. "Talent doesn't care about your address," he told a small group of donors. "It only cares if someone gives you a chance to be heard." When asked why he'd done it, he simply said, "Because one girl played a melody that reminded me what really matters. And though they never signed adoption papers, though they never called each other daughter or dad, they had built something deeper. A family made not by law but by choice, by showing up, by listening." In the quiet after the applause faded, that was enough, more than enough. 5 years had passed since that night at the Orpheum Theater, and the city had grown taller, louder, faster, but on Maplewood Street, time moved to the rhythm of piano keys and shared silences. The shelter was no longer just a shelter. It was now the Maplewood Arts and Learning Center, a bright, welcoming space where children from all walks of life came to paint, write, dance, and, most of all, play music. The music room had expanded into 3, each filled with instruments donated by people who'd heard the story and wanted to be part of it. And every Saturday morning, without fail, a young woman in her late teens would walk through the front doors, backpack slung over one shoulder, thermos of tea in hand, ready to teach her first class of the day. She wasn't famous in the way the world usually measures fame. She didn't have millions of followers or a glossy album cover, but in music schools and community centers, in the quiet corners of concert halls, her name was known, not for showy technique, but for the way she made others feel seen. She taught now not as a side job, but as a calling. Her students ranged from 6-year-olds with untied shoelaces to retirees rediscovering old dreams. She never charged them. "Pay me back by playing for someone who needs to hear it," she'd say. And the man who once mocked her on a rainy sidewalk? He still came by every week, older now, hair more silver than dark, steps a little slower, but his eyes still lit up the moment he heard a piano start to play. He no longer ran his tech empire. He'd stepped back years ago, handing leadership to others so he could focus on what mattered. The foundation. The students, the quiet work of making sure no child's gift went unheard. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves drifted past the windows, a letter arrived. It was handwritten on thick cream paper sealed with wax. Inside, an invitation. The city was dedicating a new public piano garden in the Central Park, a circle of weatherproof pianos where anyone could sit and play. And they wanted her to perform at the opening. Not just her, but them, together one last time. She read it twice, then handed it to him over tea in the sunlit kitchen of the apartment above the center, the same apartment where she'd lived since she was 10. "You think we still can?" he asked, glancing at his stiff fingers. "We don't have to play fast," she said softly. "We just have to play true." They chose a piece they'd never performed before, Schubert's Fantasy in F minor for 4 hands. It was tender, reflective, full of shared silences and gentle echoes. They rehearsed slowly, patiently, in the same room where it had all begun. Sometimes he missed a note. Sometimes his hands ached. But she never rushed him. She'd just pause, wait, and say, "Try it again. I'm right here." The day of the dedication arrived crisp and clear, the sky a perfect blue. Hundreds gathered in the park. Families, students, former shelter kids now grown. Even a few who remembered that rainy day on the bookstore corner. At the center of the garden stood 5 pianos, each painted by local artists. Keys gleaming in the sunlight. When they walked out together, him leaning lightly on his cane, her beside him calm and steady, the crowd rose not with cheers, but with a wave of quiet respect. This wasn't a spectacle. It was a homecoming. They sat at the grandest of the pianos, side by side just as they had years ago in the symphony hall. Only now the roles had softened into something deeper than teacher and student, richer than benefactor and artist. They were simply 2 souls who had walked a long road together. The music began softly, like a memory returning. His part was simple, steady, the foundation. Hers wove melodies above it, fluid and warm. There were moments when their hands brushed, not by accident, but by habit, by love. At one point, he faltered on a chord. She didn't skip ahead. She held the silence, gave him space, and when the note finally came, clear and sure, the audience exhaled as one. When the last chord faded into the autumn air, no one clapped right away. They just sat, letting the feeling settle, like dust after a storm. Then slowly, a child near the front stood and began to clap. Others joined. Soon the whole park was applauding, not for perfection but for presence, for loyalty, for the quiet miracle of 2 people who chose each other. Again and again across a lifetime afterward, as they walked back through the garden, people reached out, not for autographs but just to say thank you. A woman with tired eyes said, "My son plays now because of you." A teenager handed her a folded sheet of music. "I wrote this after hearing you play last year." She accepted it with both hands. "I'll play it next week, at Maplewood." Later, on a bench beneath a maple tree, they sat in comfortable silence. The man looked out at the pianos, now filled with strangers playing simple tunes, laughing, trying, sharing, he said, voice soft. "I used to think legacy was buildings, companies, names on plaques, and now?" she asked. "Now I know it's this." He gestured to the park, to the music floating on the breeze. "It's the ripple. The kid who hears a note and thinks maybe I can do that too." She nodded. "Grandma used to say music is a seed. You plant it and you never know where it'll grow." They stayed until the sun dipped low, casting long shadows. As they walked back to the car, he paused at the edge of the path. "I don't have much time left," he said plainly. "Not with sadness, but with peace. But I want you to promise me something. Anything. Keep the door open. At Maplewood, always." "I will," she said, voice thick. "As long as I'm breathing," he smiled. "Then I've got nothing left to worry about." Months later, on a quiet winter morning, he passed in his sleep, surrounded by photos, a stack of old concert programs, and a single sheet of music on the nightstand. The Man Who Listened, handwritten in a child's careful script. At the memorial, there was no eulogy. Just music. Students, teachers, neighbors, strangers all took turns playing at the pianos in the garden. Some played Chopin. Some played folk songs. One little girl played Clair de Lune, just like the girl on the sidewalk once had. And she? She sat at the very first piano, the one from the shelter, and played the Debussy piece. Not as a performance, as a thank you. Years after that, the Maplewood Arts Center still stands. The pianos in the park are worn smooth from use. And every Saturday morning, if you walk by the garden, you might see a woman in her 30s sitting with a child, showing them how to press middle C. She doesn't tell them the whole story. She just says music isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up. And then she listens just like someone once listened to her. But the story didn't end there, because music, once planted, keeps growing. A few years after his passing, she received a letter from a small town in rural Iowa. A high school music teacher wrote that their only piano had broken beyond repair, and their students, many from farming families, some working part-time jobs just to stay in school, had nowhere to practice. "We don't have money for a new one," the letter said. "But if there's any way your foundation could help, even just to lend an old one, these kids deserve a chance." She read it twice, then called a meeting. Within weeks, the Maplewood Foundation launched the Piano Promise program, restoring old instruments and sending them to underserved schools across the country. Each piano came with a note. "This was once played by someone who believed in you before you believed in yourself. Now it's your turn." One of the first deliveries was to that Iowa school. She went herself, not for publicity, but because she remembered what it felt like to play on a broken keyboard, hoping someone might hear. When she arrived, the students gathered nervously in the music room. She didn't give a speech. She just rolled up her sleeves, helped unload the piano, tuned it herself, and then sat down. "Anyone want to try?" she asked. A boy in a flannel shirt stepped forward. He played a simple folk tune his grandfather had taught him on an old harmonica. It wasn't polished, but it was full of heart. Afterward, she showed him how to add chords underneath. "Now it's a conversation," she said. Between the melody and the harmony, she stayed for 2 days, teaching, listening, encouraging. Before she left, the students gathered around the piano and played a song together, just 3 chords repeated with everyone singing a local harvest hymn. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. On the drive back, the sun setting over endless fields, she thought of the man who'd once laughed at her on a rainy sidewalk, and then chose to stay. She thought of her grandmother, humming lullabies in a tiny apartment. She thought of all the hands that had touched that first piano, all the voices that had been given a chance to be heard, and she knew the work wasn't done. It never would be, because the greatest legacy isn't in headlines or halls. It's in the quiet choice to show up, again and again, for the music and for each other. Now, decades later, if you visit the Central Park, you'll still find the piano garden. The benches are worn, the paint on the piano's faded, but the music never stops. On any given afternoon, you might hear a child playing their first scale, a teenager practicing a pop song, an elder playing a tune from their youth. And if you listen closely beneath it all, you can still hear the echo of a rainy afternoon, of a girl who played not for fame but for love, and a man who learned, too late but not too late, how to listen. And in that music, they both live on, because true legacies aren't carved in stone. They're sung in classrooms, played on street corners, and whispered in the quiet spaces between one heart and another. And as long as someone is willing to listen, the song never really ends.